faculty, St. Stephen's College. Welcome you all to the final lecture of the lecture series held as a part of our flagship event, the National Economics Festival 2023. At the outset, I will read out the code of conduct that I request the audience to abide by. The audience is requested to keep their microphones switched off throughout the session. They are encouraged to turn on their cameras if possible. Everyone is expected to maintain decorum during the lecture. And once the speaker has finished, the session will be open for questions, for which the audience is requested to send their questions to the questions moderator via the Zoom chat box so that the speaker may answer them. I will now pass the mic on to Tatva to introduce our speaker.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Economic Society, I would like to welcome you all to yet another lecture of the lecture series held as part of the National Economics Festival 2023. Coronavirus has transformed many aspects of our lives. Among many of its immediate consequences include the volatility in market prices due to the sudden supply chain disruptions. Today, we're extremely honored to welcome one of the experts in the field, Dr. Prachi Mishra, to give us her insights on the topic, Understanding US Inflation During the COVID Era. Dr. Prachi Mishra is the Chief of the Systemic Issues Division in the Research Department at the IMF. Prior to joining the IMF, she worked at Goldman Sachs as Managing Director, Global Macro Research and India Chief Economist. During 2014 to 2017, she served as Specialist Advisor and Head of the Strategic Research Unit at the RBI. Prior to that, she was Senior Economist in the Ministry of Finance and at the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council in the Government of India. She was awarded the Mahalanobis Memorial Medal by the Indian Econometric Society in 2018 for her contributions to quantitative economics. Some of her other accomplishments include the invitation by the Government of UK to their International Leaders Programme, IMF Research Awards for exceptional contribution to low-income country work, and for innovative research in political economy. Her other recent interests include in the fields of international economics, banking and finance, and political economy. Ma'am, we're extremely grateful to you for giving us some of your valuable time, and we look forward to this session. Thank you. And so without further ado, I pass on the mic to you.
Thank you very much. I didn't get your name.
I'm Tatva.
Tatva, okay. It says Tatva at Economic Society. I wasn't sure, but thank you, Tatva. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to talk to you all. And as Tatva said, I'll present for the next 25-30 minutes or so. But I think the idea is to make it interactive, and please feel free to ask questions. I think the organizers said that towards the end, but if there are any clarification questions, if it's okay with Tatva, it's okay to ask clarification questions in between, because I think the important part is to get the lecture across. Is that okay?
Yes, ma'am, I don't think it should be an issue.
Yes, okay, excellent. I have to start. You can see my slides, you can hear me, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So I think I have to start with the usual disclaimer because I work for the IMF. So I thought, I will, as Tatva said, I'm going to focus most of the presentation on US inflation. I thought I'll just give a little bit of overview on generally how, global inflation has been looking like, and this is really a hot topic globally. So let me start with the first part. So this, this chart on the left basically shows that consumer price inflation, or the headline inflation, CPI, headline CPI, has, as you can see, is risen pretty consistently. So the red and the blue are the red is for EMs, the blue is for advanced economies, and yellow is for low-income countries. And you can see how since early 2021 there's been a sharp rise in inflation. And I think let me make 2 points from the chart on the left. The rise has been very broad-based, as you can see, across regions. But at the same time, if you look at the dashed lines, These are the core or underlying inflation, basically stripping out inflation in commodities like food, fuel, etc. And that you can see, the dashed lines are still pretty elevated. So this is really a global issue, and that's what I'm trying to tell you from the chart on the left. On the right, this is more selected group of countries, basically advanced and emerging economies. And here, as the blue line is again headline CPI inflation, as you understand, consumer price inflation has peaked, is more or less the view. However, if you look at the red line, which is again the underlying inflation, still remains very high. So what has really driven this rise in inflation? And really, there are three factors which are responsible. One is, across the world, and particularly in advanced economies, there's been unprecedented fiscal support. So a lot of households, individuals got cash in hand. So what is called, so there was a lot of pent up demand because during COVID, people were locked inside the houses. So when the restrictions eased, there was a sharp increase in so-called pent up demand. And that's what you see on the left hand here is cumulated excess savings. So people save savings relative to what could be predicted based on a pre-crisis trend. And you can see for most economies, and these are mostly advanced economies for which we have data and we've estimated it, it looks pretty the same. There were excess savings in these economies, which people went out and spent, and that led to a high inflation. The second reason is rapidly rising commodity prices. So during the COVID episode, we saw rapidly rising commodity prices, whether you look at oil, food, metals, and that is another reason for why headline inflation went up sharply. We've seen some softening more recently, which you can see on the right. And finally, the third reason for why inflation rates have risen is supply chain disruption. So you must have heard during COVID a lot of discussion on supply bottlenecks, congestions at ports. So here, basically, this is what it's showing, particularly the black line is the advanced economies, particularly in advanced economies during after COVID, you saw a lot of these supply chain disruptions. And this supply chain disruption measure is basically proxied by the difference between the supply delivery time sub-index in the PMI and a counterfactual measure. So this is bottom line, I think, a sharp increase in supply disruptions, of course, has come down more recently, but this was also one of the factors contributing to rise in inflation. Let me also say that, uncertainty has been a very important factor around the inflation outlook more generally globally. There's been uncertainty about, how much slack is there in the economy. That is how much, because that's an important factor which drives inflation. There's also uncertainty, as you can see, on, particular particular prices in particular sectors, for example, food. And as you can see from the right picture, in low income countries, but also in middle income countries, food is a big share of the consumer basket, and that has contributed quite significantly to higher inflation. So a lot of uncertainty on how food prices will evolve, a lot of uncertainty on the labor market, which is true even now. We don't know how the labor market is evolving. And this is just an example, coming out of COVID, you saw, wages going up, but at the same time, as you know, there were a lot of, sectoral pressures. There was not enough labor, and you had wages, but at the same time, hours per employee were going down. So this also created a lot of uncertainty and confusion. So with this, introduction, which is more global, let me zoom in into a topic of understanding U.S. inflation during the COVID era. This is joint work with Lawrence Ball and Daniel Lee, and this is something we've been working on and for the last few years since COVID, and it's still updating some of the analysis, which I'll try to present to you. Why, let me also just say a few words that, why did I decide to present this to this audience? Of course, the context, after 4 decades of low US inflation, high inflation has really emerged as a central economic problem of the COVID era, even in the United States. And 12-month CPI inflation was reported at 8.5% in July 2022, which is like historical for the US, because US has had low stable inflation for decades. It's come down, but it's still very high at close to 6.5% in December. And the COVID experience has really produced a lot of analysis on why inflation rose, where is it heading in the future, and what we do is try to contribute to this debate. A couple of more reasons why I decided to dig into US inflation for this audience. First, as I said, very hot topic globally. Second, the evolution of US inflation, note that it has implications for US interest rates. And that can have huge spillovers for the global economy, and especially for emerging markets like India, as we saw during the taper tantrum in 2013. And more importantly, the rise in inflation and the rise in interest rates happens very suddenly, and it's not priced in by the market, it can be particularly damaging for the global economy and financial markets. And finally, I think most importantly and relevant to this audience is also, the paper tries to present a framework, which I hope can be useful for many of you as you try to look into these issues across countries. So this is, the framework, which is very simple. We decompose headline inflation, headline consumer price inflation. This is the consumer price inflation you see into 2 components: the core inflation, which is the underlying inflation, and headline inflation shocks. So core inflation is very standard textbook. It's a function of long-term expected inflation and the level of tightness in the labor market, or so-called slack. How much slack is there? If there's a lot of slack in the labor market, underlying inflation is going to be lower. And a primary measure of core is weighted median inflation rate. And what it does is basically it strips out unusually large price changes in any industry, and not only food and energy as common measures do. Headline inflation shocks is basically the non-core component. And think about these as high frequency movements arising from large price changes in particular sectors of the economy. Think about fluctuations in energy prices, or in the context of COVID, as I mentioned, price changes in industries affected by shutdowns and supply disruptions. Think about travel, autos. So these are basically headline inflation shocks. And these are nothing but, we measure this by deviations of headline from the core. And basically a key feature of the analysis we do is to study the pass-through from these industry price shocks into core inflation. So let me just try to present to you this slide, which shows 2 charts. On the left-hand side is basically the black line is the monthly headline inflation. As you can see, this has been really volatile all through the pandemic. If you look at core inflation, or as I said, measured by the weighted median inflation rate, this is much less volatile. And it drifted down during initial part of the pandemic. But since then, it's been increasing. However, even till September 2021, it was below the levels you saw in January 2020. And this experience basically, and the common view that these non-core movements are basically transitory, helps explain why economists, including us, were at that time, were less concerned about rising inflation. Since the middle of 2021, there's been almost a steady rise, and high monthly rates, as you can see, have led to a 12-month median to follow, to be on a steadily rising trend. So this is, as you can see, this chart is fairly shocking, even for a country like the United States, which was actually struggling with the problem of low inflation for many decades, inflation being below target, and you have inflation now, even underlying inflation at 6-7%. Let me stop here and see if there are any clarification questions, or if the context is clear, rather than me just going on speaking.
Ma'am, I think we have no questions at the moment in
Okay.
the chat box, so we can proceed here.
Okay, so what we do is try to explain core inflation, as I said, with 3 variables. One is expected inflation, tightness of the labor market, and past headline inflation shocks. These two are just very standard so-called Phillips curve variables. This one actually captures the pass-through from headline inflation into core. And let me just give a few details. Expected inflation is basically measured by median 10-year headline CPI forecast from Survey of Professional Forecasters. Labor market tightness is, up until the pandemic, a standard measure was unemployment rate. Since the pandemic, I think a lot of researchers have started using V over U. So what is, V over U? V over U is the ratio of vacancies to unemployed. And this has a strong theoretical appeal as a measure of wage pressures that feed into price inflation. So V over U basically determines the threat points of workers and firms that bargain over wages in search models, some of the classic ones like Mortensen and Pisiridis. In addition, we also find, in our own work, some evidence that this variable does pretty well in explaining both wage and price inflation, even in the pre-pandemic era. Importantly, I think we use 12-month averages, or 4-quarter moving averages of V over U to capture lags in the effect of labor market tightness, which literature typically finds. Let me also say, a few words about these headline inflation shocks. And the pass-through effects. So pass-through effects can occur through different channels. Think about, the effect of headline inflation shocks on wages or on other costs of production. If inflation is high, CPI inflation is high, workers and I actually go and bargain for higher wages. So basically, we take averages over 4 quarters or 12 months, consistent with the evidence that these shocks may transmit to inflation slowly. Let me show you, how V over U, vacancies to unemployed, is an important variable in explaining core inflation. So the left-hand side actually shows monthly data, whereas right-hand side shows quarterly data. In this, paper, basically we focus on the period from 1985. So 1985 to 2019 was a period of very low inflation in the US. It includes both the Great Moderation from 1987 to 2007, as well as the Great Recession and Recovery, and then the COVID era. So the bottom line is, if anybody who looks, has basic knowledge of economics can, look at this chart and say that, look, the data really appear consistent with an upward sloping relationship between inflation gap, which is a difference between inflation and expectations, and, labor market tightness, or V over, as measured by V over U. And, this period has been a lot in discussion, late 2021 and 2022, and they actually appear pretty consistent with the high levels of vacancies to unemployed, which you saw more recently. I should also mention that there has been some recent developments. Median inflation has fallen more recently, while V over U remains more as high as before. And this has been, this is something which we are looking into it. But again, bottom line is that the high inflation gaps which we saw are pretty consistent with high levels of vacancies to unemployed and a pre-pandemic relationship between the two variables. This is, I think, again, important to students. How you measure underlying inflation is very important, because underlying inflation is basically standard. The literature usually measured it by headline inflation, excluding food and fuel, because food and fuel were known to be, the more volatile components of inflation. That story has changed, completely during the pandemic, because, in the pandemic, we saw sectors other than food and fuel being fairly volatile. So what we do is, on the left-hand side, basically, we repeat the relationship between V over U and inflation gap using a standard measure of underlying inflation. On the right is what I showed you in the previous picture. And you can see, how different, if you used a standard measure, the relationship is all over. This is called XFE. Basically, XFE inflation gap fluctuates erratically. And basically, it reflects noise in XFE that comes from large price changes in industries other than food and industry, as I talked about, during the pandemic. So let me just talk about a little bit, the basic framework, as I said, tries to explain this core inflation gap as a function of V over U and headline inflation shocks. And let me point out that, there have been arguments as well as evidence in the literature why the effects of both these V over U and H may be very nonlinear. For example, Olivier Blanchard emphasizes the salience of large shocks. He argues that, look, the costs of living, if you measure by headline CPI inflation, influences wage demands, but this effect may be very strong for large movements in inflation, which is salient to wage setters. So what we do is draw on this literature to allow for non-linearities, and I'll show you some figures in a very flexible way by including cubic functions in V over U and headline inflation shocks to explain the evolution of inflation. Let me again stop here, see any clarifications, is it getting across? Are people following?
Ma'am, I think we have not received any questions at the moment now. So,
okay.
We can...
So basically, let me move on. And this table presents estimates of the Phillips curve. So, and we are reporting, results based on quarterly as well as monthly data. The data starts in 1985. As I mentioned before, this is the beginning of Great Moderation, which is a period of low macroeconomic volatility. And here we are presenting estimates with the pre-pandemic period. And here, this is extended to the most recent period. I think this is till Q3 or till September, these estimates. We are not presenting estimates for the pandemic period alone. As you can guess, you cannot estimate as, you're estimating 7 parameters with just very few data points. As you can see, square and cubic terms are very significant for both V over U as well as headline inflation shocks. So the data do indicate non-linearity in these variables. And let me show you a picture which depicts these non-linearities in a more graphical form, because pictures always speak louder than words. So the left-hand side shows the fitted values of inflation gap as a function of V over U with headline inflation shock set equal to 0. And basically, you can see the non-linearity quite clearly here, right? Large marginal effect on core inflation when the level of V over U is very low or it's very high. And the right shows the same thing, but for these headline inflation shocks, other than core, movements in prices of particular industries. And as you can see, even this looks very asymmetric. If you have negative values of headline inflation shock, that is, headline is below the core, you have negligible effect on core inflation. However, when this is high, you have a sharp positive effect. And there's a very nice paper by Oviong and Verman, and this what is basically he names this as rockets and feather effects. So there are strong non-linearities in the effect of both labor market tightness as measured by vacancy to unemployed, but also these non-linearities in effect of these headline inflation shocks or large price changes in particular industries. Then, what do we do is we ask, do the variables in our inflation equation really explain core inflation during the pandemic? And what we do is we compare the actual and fitted values of core inflation during the pandemic. And the left-hand chart shows the estimates based on the full sample, whereas the right-hand chart shows the estimate based on a pre-pandemic sample. And as you can see, by and large, I think these are the fitted values. And these are the dark lines are the actual values. They're pretty close to each other through most of the sample. And importantly, the right hand is actually an out of sample forecast. What does it mean, out of sample forecast? So basically, the good fit, we can explain the pandemic experience based on the paths of V over U and headline inflation shocks and the estimated effects of these variables in the pre-pandemic period. So I think the right chart is particularly interesting because of that. And let me also point out that more recently, there have been these growing negative residuals. We are trying to look into, what explains and see what, how we could tweak our specification to account for the more recent experience. And one last thing from this chart is, if you look at these red dashed lines, these show the fitted values for core inflation gap with the path, with the actual path of V over U, but headline inflation shock set to 0, meaning that this shows the effect of labor market tightness. And as you can see that the effect of labor market tightness has actually grown over time. Initially it accounted very little, but by late 2021 it accounted for most of the inflation gap we saw. Let me move to another, what was called the American Rescue Plan. So many economists and politicians blamed the American Rescue Plan, which was passed in March 2021. This was the $1.9 trillion Biden stimulus plan, which had unemployment benefits, stimulus checks for the overheating of the economy and the rise in inflation. So we do, our framework does suggest that there was some such effect, to the extent that this policy stimulated demand. It would reduce unemployment, it would increase vacancies, higher V over U, and also that would raise inflation. Here, what we do is try to quantify that effect. I'm not going to go into the details, but I think here basically what we find is that there is some truth to this argument. And what we do is we compare the path of core inflation to the path in the counterfactual without the ARP. And this is what we show here. So it's basically accounting for about 40% of the rise in 12-month core inflation. And if you look at headline inflation, it's accounting for quarter of the rise in headline inflation. So bottom line, the American Rescue Plan did play a role. It accounted for quarter of the rise in headline CPI inflation, but it is not everything. I think that's something to keep in mind. So with all these ammunition, what we do in the paper is basically try to do an accounting exercise of the overall sources of the rise in inflation. And we compare the 12-month headline CPI inflation rate in December 2022, which was 6.4%, to the rate of 1.3% in December 2020, when the early pandemic slump had pushed the really inflation down. And we account for this 5.1 percentage point difference between the two inflation rates, and we can and we decompose into different components. And using the estimated equations which I showed you, and in particular, I think you must have we decompose headline inflation shock into what we call the pass-through effect. How much of these particular price changes in particular industries feed into core inflation, or the direct effect on headline inflation. And here we break it into energy, backlogs, and auto prices. These are three variables which appear to be important, and we actually find them to be important in explaining these price changes in particular sectors. And this is consistent with popular discourse that energy played a big role, backlogs, which is a measure of supply disruptions, played a big role, or auto prices played a big role. So a couple of points, salient points from this decomposition exercise. So if you look at just the direct and pass-through effects of these sectoral shocks or headline inflation shocks, they account for half of the rise in headline inflation. So they were indeed important. And out of the half, the important thing to note is only 20% is the direct effect of these sectoral price changes. 30% is actually passed through of these sectoral price changes into core inflation. And most of these is driven actually by energy and backlogs. Auto is important too. Auto is more through the pass-through effect, but you have a negative direct effect because auto prices came down. There was a run-up in auto price in summer 2021. But the effect on headline inflation turned negative as these price increases were partly reversed. This is also the V over U, or the labor market tightness is also an important factor. It accounts for half of the rise in headline inflation rates. Let me also say that, as inflation began to rise in March 2021, Fed Chair Powell predicted that the increase would be neither particularly large or persistent. And at the Jackson Hole conference, I think that August, Powell remained quite sanguine, noting that, the absence so far of broad-based inflation pressures. And this view was supported by many economists. I think Team Transitory, including myself and the authors at that point. But I think today it's fairly clear that inflation was much higher than we expected. So what really accounts for this forecasting errors? So what we do here is we compare the performance of alternative equations for monthly core inflation. And as you can see, our preferred equation does perform well to explain actual inflation, which is in the dark line. And each of the others, each of the other lines here shows, the different versions of this equation. For example, if you don't include non-linearities. And as you can see, the most traditional equation, which has just a linear unemployment term, actually performs quite poorly. It predicts the decrease in inflation in 2020, but almost no increase since then, reflecting the fact that, 12-month average of the unemployment rate has actually not fallen much below the so-called natural rates. And the different lines show that each of the modifications to a traditional specification, whether how you modify the measure of slack, how you bring in non-linearity, how you bring in pass-through, actually contributes quite materially to the good fit of the final equation. I should also add that today we can see that, even before the pandemic, the inflation equations fit the data better with tightness measured by a non-linear function of V over U than a linear function of U, and with a pass-through effect. Before 2020, however, the evidence on these points was not striking enough to influence the inflation models of most economists. Let me again pause here and see, if there are, before I move into, the forecasting and the future, any questions or any clarifications.
Ma'am, actually, a few of them had questions. One of them wanted to know what they wanted you to clarify what the XFE inflation was.
Yeah, XFE is basically excluding food and energy. So in theory, I think movements in food and energy are fairly volatile. And when you are trying to explain underlying inflation, you strip out food and energy. So XFE is excluding food and energy.
All right, ma'am. Thank you. And we have a follow-up question as well. The second question was, what's the interpretation of the square and cube values of the Phillips curve and the values mentioned earlier?
Right. I think this is a good question. What is the interpretation and what do we mean? So this, I think, graph shows the interpretation. So square and cube term can either be in labor market tightness or in headline inflation shock. What is headline inflation shock? These are sectoral price changes in particular industries, as I said, travel, auto during the pandemic, or more traditionally, food, energy, etc. So the square and cubic term basically means that the effect is very non-linear. And if you look at, V over U, the effect is fairly, if you look at, low V over U or high V over U, the effect is the effect on inflation is very high. And you see it even more in these headline inflation shocks or price changes in particular industry. So if you have large, high, big changes in food, energy, big changes in travel, auto, or, the sectors which were more affected during the pandemic, if you have big changes in these, you have, the impact on inflation is very high. So this is basically what, as I said, Ovyong and Verman and Ovyong called a feathers and rocket effect. So the effect becomes very sharp when you have, at high levels. So this is square and cubic term is one functional form to include non-linearity in the impact of these variables. And you see it very nicely, I think, in these two pictures. So at low levels, on V over U, you see the effect to be symmetric. So if it's very low or very high, the effect on inflation is very high. In headline inflation shock, you particularly see non-linearity on the other end. That is, if they're large headline inflation shock, the increase in inflation is much higher than when they are small shocks. So this is again basically the feathers and the rocket effect. So bottom line, I think the square and the cubic term, the interpretation of this is this is one functional form to introduce non-linearity in the impact of these particular variables. In our case, labor market tightness and these headline inflation shocks.
All right. Thank you very much.
Should I move on?
Yes,
Should I move on? Okay.
Yes.
So as I don't know how many of you follow this guru Yogi Berra. He's made the comment that it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. So what we do is we focus on two factors that shape how much unemployment needs to rise to contain inflation. And the two factors are basically the behavior of the beverage curve, and the second factor is behavior of inflation expectations. And let me describe, and let me also say there's much uncertainty about these issues. So what is the beverage curve? Beverage curve is the relationship between unemployment rate and vacancy rate. And as you can see, the relationship is downward sloping. So, if unemployment rate is very high, you have lower vacancies. And if unemployment rate is very low, you have higher vacancies. What happened during the pandemic is very interesting. And as you can see, there's a red line, which is post-pandemic, and there's a blue line, which is pre-pandemic. So this curve basically shifted out during the pandemic. And there's a lot of ongoing debate about why did it shift, whether it will shift back in. And there were, Fed, for example, a Federal Reserve Board, Figueroa and Waller, who said that, no, actually, vacancies can decrease without much of an increase in unemployment rate, whereas there was Blanchard, Domash, and Summers that it's unlikely to do so. So what we do is we consider, both the optimistic and the pessimistic cases, whether this is going to come back or this is not going to come back, and that is a crucial variable. How the labor market evolves is a crucial variable in understanding how inflation will evolve. So this is, this shows that, so because of the relationship between we and you can actually derive the relationship between U and inflation gap. Note that, we had shown that inflation gap is a function of V over U. Now we have the labor market equation, which gives us a relationship between V and U, and meaning, we can also get a relationship from the beverage curve on U and V over U. And from that, we can, translate to the impact on inflation gap. And here, this is what you see. You can use the beverage curve. So we can start with the inflation equation we estimated, combine it with the beverage curve to actually draw a relationship between U and inflation gap. How much unemployment do you need? How much pain do you need to actually bring down inflation? A lot of debate and discussion around this. And this figure basically shows the relationship between U and inflation gap for the two beverage curves. So, and again, once again, a striking feature that jumps out from these curves is the non-linearity. If unemployment rates are very high, the relationship is pretty close to linear, as you can see, and very flat. For example, for the pre-pandemic period, which is the blue line, the slope is about minus 0.28 at about 8% unemployment rate, and it's about minus 0.3% at 6% unemployment rate. And these numbers are pretty comparable to what you had pre-pandemic. However, if you look at 4% unemployment rate, the slope is, especially in a pandemic situation, is about minus 0.7 at 4% unemployment rate, and that rises dramatically to if at 3.5%, it rises to minus 2.8. So basically, I think this makes a good, clearly the point about non-linearity in the effect. How much pain you have to take to actually reduce inflation. It depends really. The effect is very at low levels of unemployment rate, when the economy is quite overheated. You actually have to take a lot of pain to reduce inflation. So the effect is very non-linear. What is clear is, if you stay on the COVID beverage curve, which is the red line, it is even, a worse unemployment inflation trade-off. Pi is actually, for any U, inflation is actually higher. So if you want to reduce inflation by a given amount, you would have to increase U by a much bigger amount. So you can see this by, if you think about a line going from, say 4 to 3.8, you can see that, the increase in inflation really depends on which part of the beverage curve you are. So bottom line, I think if you stay on the COVID beverage curve, a worse unemployment inflation trade-off. Inflation is actually pi is, for any given level of U, pi is actually higher. The second, as I said, the second determinant of inflation going forward is whether inflation, you must have heard a lot, whether inflation expectations will remain anchored. And we have seen some measures of inflation expectations which have actually gone up. So what we do is in the paper is we consider both the benign case, that is inflation expectations actually come back to the pre-pandemic era, as well as the pessimistic cases. And pessimistic cases are two, basically, where expectations drift as in COVID, and or expectations drift pre-anchoring phase, which is, inflation expectations in the US were pretty much anchored from 2000. And this is the pre-anchoring phase when expectations were not anchored. So where is inflation heading and how do you go about assessing that? So what we do is we compute the paths of inflation conditional on paths of unemployment rate, and depending on the two assumptions. So let me take you some, through some results. So this is the simulated path of 12-month core inflation and median CPI as we measure it, based on different beverage curve and based on different expectation assumptions. And basically, as I said, so for each assumption on whether you're optimistic on the beverage curve or whether you're pessimistic on the beverage curve, the impact on inflation will depend on whether expectations drift or they revert. So this is the drift parameter. I don't have time to go into the details. So basically, this is the most, if the drift parameter gamma is very small, meaning that, it actually drifts a lot. So expectations are more unanchored if lower is gamma. So even if you are an optimistic beverage curve, you'll have inflation higher if your expectations actually are more unanchored. And so this basically gives you a range of estimates of inflation based on what you assume on expectations and what you assume on how the labor market is going to behave. So this chart actually shows you with FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee, unemployment projections of 4.4% in 2024 as of September. So the red cases are with the pessimistic beverage curve, blue are with the optimistic beverage curve. And basically, inflation starts, peaks around, peaks between, somewhere here around November, between December 2022 and November 2023, depending on what you assume. But I think one, conclusion from this chart is that the Fed's target is about 2%, and if you translate it into median CPI, the Fed target is about 2.5%. It is unlikely to reach, in most of the assumptions, it's very unlikely to reach the target by end of 2024. It can, if you're very optimistic about the beverage curve and the inflation expectations, you can bring inflation down to target. But if both of these stars don't align, it's very less likely. Then I think what we do is we also, simulate the path for, this was a famous, Larry Summers 7.5% unemployment path. And there, if you're willing to inflict more pain on the economy, then you can bring inflation down. And you can see that the variation here is much lower. But again, it depends on, even here, it depends on assumptions on the labor market, which is beverage curve, and on the expectations. So with this, let me conclude. As I mentioned, Yogi Berra observed that it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. In my previous job, I actually was more in the forecasting role. Now I am more in analyzing the role. So I'm happy about that. So this aphorism applies to the study of inflation. So what we find is for United States, if you look backward, we can really account fairly well for inflation behavior during the pandemic. And basically a tight labor market pushed up underlying inflation, or so-called core inflation, and headline inflation actually deviated from the core because of sharp rises in energy and auto prices and supply chain problems. And pass-through of these headline inflation shocks actually magnified the rise in core. Looking forward, we can forecast inflation if we specify two things: the path of unemployment and future behavior of the beverage curve, and number two, inflation expectations. As I said, there's a lot of uncertainty in these factors, so it's really difficult to make, unconditional predictions. I think one finding we have is that the forecast of the Fed policymakers, that inflation will return to target, while unemployment rises only to 4.5 or 4.4%. They're reasonable only under very optimistic assumptions about both the beverage curve and the inflation expectations. And if either proves less benign, then reducing inflation is likely to require higher unemployment than the Fed anticipates. Let me stop here, and happy to take any questions.
Right. Thank you, Ma'am, for your insightful words. Now, the floor is still open for questions. So please send in your questions to the questions moderator, Leanne, and I now pass it over to Leanne.
Okay, so now I will be putting forward some of the questions that was asked by the audience. So the first question is, are the rate increases by the Fed actually passing through to the US economy? And is there any difference in the monetary policy transmission in the US banking system and the Indian banking system?
Yeah, I think this question is more about monetary transmission, and which is not something which we address in this paper. There are different channels of monetary transmission. I think there is the interest rate channel, there's the exchange rate channel, there's a financial sector channel, and there's a huge literature on which is more, which is stronger and which is less stronger. So I think the answer is yes. I think, but it depends on a number of factors. As comparing, the US monetary transmission versus developing countries, including India, it really, I think, actually have a paper on looking at, what factors determine transmission in more developing countries. First of all, we do show that the transmission is lower, and it takes longer, and it depends on a lot of factors like how open, how big is your banking system, how how flexible is your exchange rates. So just bottom line, I will not go into it's a separate topic than what I showed you, and there's a huge literature which you can look at on monetary transmission and how how interest rates affect the economy, both the output and inflation. But clearly, what I can say, it's very different in emerging and developing economies than in advanced economies like the US.
All right, thank you. The second question would be, ma'am, companies have been used to functioning in a really low rate environment. Now that the rates are rising, how do you think it'll affect their investment decisions, and what could be the long-term impacts of this?
Yeah, again, unrelated to the presentation, but it's a good question. I think this is really a topic which is being discussed globally. That is, interest rates, especially in advanced economies, have been low for very long. And now you are seeing, tightening of global financial conditions, interest rates, but also, other measures of, financial conditions beyond interest rates as well, equity prices, exchange rates, etc. So I think, how will it affect investment decisions? It will depend on whether agents perceive the increase as temporary or permanent, I think. And so far, I think, and what is really the long-term interest rate in the economy? I think we are doing work at the IMF where we actually still think that the natural interest rate or long-term interest rate should come down. So to the extent that, over a reasonable time frame, we think that these interest rates are going to come down. I think that should be a more positive for investment in the economy. That said, I think even temporary rises in global financial conditions are can affect more short-term investment decisions. But I think it again depends, to answer your question, depends on what kind of investment are we talking about, what time frame of investment are we talking about, how sensitive it is to interest rates, because there are many components of investment that maybe are not that sensitive to interest rates. So the answer depends, I think. But it is, that said, it's a big issue of rise, tightening global financial conditions in advanced economies, but more globally as well.
All right, ma'am. Thank you very much. Moving on to the next question. How do we understand US inflation with respect to the savings paradox? To elaborate, while on a micro level, it may be more suitable for individuals to save their money, but on a macro level, the same might prove extremely detrimental to the economy. So what is the best course of action for individuals in such a scenario?
Yeah, I think I don't know if I have an answer to the question, but I think savings more globally, though we didn't look at in the United States, but globally, I think I showed you a picture of, maybe I can share the screen again and just a sec. So as you can see on the left chart, I showed you excess savings. So this is savings across a set of economies, not only the US, and those predicted based on a pre-crisis trend. So what happened during the pandemic was there was a sharp increase in this, in these people were locked inside homes and they were basically not able to spend as much. So, so one of the reasons we saw rising inflation starting 2021 was this accumulated excess savings and pent-up demand, which led to a sharp increase in inflation, which also contributed to the sharp increase in inflation. Again, I think whether this is temporary, whether this is permanent, we'll see. Some of these effects should wane as economies have, COVID has receded, economies have opened up. You should see some of these effects to fade over time. I'm not sure if this answers your question, but happy to follow up.
Right, ma'am. Thank you so much. Now we will be taking the last question for the day. So, ma'am, the audience we have today are mainly students of the Delhi University, and you are one of the alumni of DU. So I'm sure all of us here would be eager to know more about your college life. Can you please share some fond memories of your college life?
Yeah, I have nothing, too exciting to share. I think I was like one of you. I did my undergrad from IP and my master's from Delhi School of Economics. I was in the hostel in IP, and I was in the hostel also. I remember Meghdut in Delhi School of Economics in Delhi University. So I think it was just nothing exciting, but I think a very great peer group, like all of you. I think what I think shaped my path and career starting from that is the peer group, which is very important, and aspirations of again, my peer group, the discussions. So it really set strong foundations. I went for a PhD at Columbia University in New York, and I think the training I received was very strong. I think so. I think you should all be proud, I think, and try out new things. And I'm sure you have a good foundation to go ahead.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Great to see you all, and happy to be in touch.
Thank you, ma'am. And thank you, audience, for all the questions. But before we move on, I request everyone to turn on their camera so that we can have a quick picture. So I'll be clicking the picture in the count of 3. 3, 2, 1. Thank you. So now I would like to call upon our society's staff advisor, Ms. Poonam Kalra, to say a few words.
Macri, I think we can proceed. Ma'am is not here. So, yeah.
All right, then. Since she's not here, then I now invite Anjana to propose the vote of thanks.
Respected Speaker, Dr. Prachi Mishra, senior members, and to all the participants, a very good evening. Inflation is a phenomena which affects each and every one of us. Today, I am sure that we have gained better insights on US inflation, especially during the COVID era. I take this opportunity to thank our most distinguished speaker, Dr. Prachi Mishra, for taking time out of her busy schedule to enlighten us with her valuable insights. I'd like to thank the college administration for their guidance and support. Finally, I would like to thank the audience for being such great listeners and active participants in today's lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Have a pleasant evening ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Great to see you. Bye.
Bye, ma'am. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Yeah, so, wait.